There is a moment I return to more often than I probably should. I was 22 years old. It was a Tuesday. The chapel had already been swept, the morning prayers finished, and Sister Margaret, the woman who had guided my formation for 3 years, the woman I trusted more than almost anyone on earth, called me into the small room off the novitiate hallway, the one with the wooden chair and the single window that looked out onto the garden. I thought she was going to talk to me about my vows, about what it meant to consecrate my life, about the weight and the beauty and the cost of the commitment I was preparing to walk away from. Instead, she closed the door softly, sat across from me, folded her hands in her lap the way she always did when something mattered, and said this: "The world outside these walls will confuse you, men especially. Pray, stay modest, remember your dignity." Then she stood, then she left, and that was it. That was the conversation. 11 words and a door closing behind her, and a garden through the window that looked exactly the same as it had 5 minutes before, completely indifferent to the fact that I had just been handed the sum total of my preparation for re-entering a world I had not fully lived in since I was 19 years old. I had spent 4 years inside convent walls. 4 years of structured silence, communal prayer, formation, discipline, a life organized entirely around spiritual devotion and deliberate withdrawal from everything the outside world considered normal. And when I left, when I eventually made the decision to return to secular life, the preparation I received for navigating actual human relationships, actual men, actual intimacy and desire, and the complicated geography of a woman's own body, could be summarized in 11 words. Stay modest. Pray. Remember your dignity. My name is Sister Claire, though I haven't gone by that name in 6 years. This channel is where I tell the truth about what religious formation actually does to a woman's understanding of herself, of men, of her own body, of love, the things the institution called preparation, the things it quietly, efficiently, and with complete sincerity left out. If you're new here, please subscribe, please like this video, turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next, and drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. These conversations matter more than you know, and I read every single one. What I want to talk about today is not a single experience, it is a pattern. It is something that happened not just to me, but to virtually every woman I lived alongside in formation, every woman I have spoken to since leaving, every woman who spent years inside a system that was genuinely trying to protect her, and in the process left her completely unarmed. There are 3 things women in religious life are taught about men. I have had years now to sit with this, to name it properly, to understand what was actually being communicated beneath the language of virtue and modesty and spiritual discipline. 3 things, and not one of them told us what we actually needed to know. The first thing we were taught is that men are a category of danger. Not in those words, never in those words. The formation language was softer than that, more elegant, more spiritually framed. We were taught that the world outside the convent was full of occasion for sin, that men specifically represented a particular kind of spiritual risk, that a woman's purity, her interior life, her consecration, all of it required a vigilance around male presence that could never fully be relaxed. I remember a specific conversation during a formation session in my 2nd year. One of the older sisters was preparing a group of us for a pastoral assignment that would take us outside the convent to work in a community center. Real work, real people, men and women and children in ordinary life. She stood at the front of the room and said, with complete gentleness, with complete care, that we should be aware that the men we encountered would not be living by the same interior disciplines we were, that their attention, if directed toward us, should be met with holy indifference, that the correct posture in the presence of male attention was a kind of spiritual neutrality. Don't engage more than necessary. Don't invite conversation that isn't about the work. Be warm, be charitable, be kind. But never forget what you are. At the time I heard this as wisdom. It felt like protection, like someone was giving me a map for a terrain I didn't know. What I understand now is that she was not describing men. She was describing her fear of them. And that fear, dressed in the language of virtue, was being handed down to us as formation. Because here is what that teaching actually produced in practice. It produced a generation of women who understood men entirely through the lens of danger and abstinence, who had no framework for male humanity beyond either brother in Christ or potential occasion for sin, who had never been taught to simply exist alongside a man without it meaning something spiritual, something risky, something that required management. When I left the convent, I was 27 years old. I had spent years learning how to pray, how to live in community, how to serve, how to be still. I did not know how to sit next to a man on a bus, without my entire nervous system treating it as an event that required interpretation. I did not know how to receive a compliment without immediately cataloging it as something to be suspicious of. I did not know the difference between a man being kind and a man being dangerous, because I had been taught that the line between those two things required constant and exhausting vigilance. That is not wisdom. That is damage wearing wisdom's clothes. If this is resonating with you, if you grew up somewhere that handed you silence instead of truth, please subscribe to this channel and like this video. It means everything to me. Every like, every subscriber, every comment tells me this story needs to be told. And we are only getting started. The second thing we were taught about men is that our own desires did not exist. Or if they did, they were the problem. This one is harder to explain because it was never stated directly. No one stood in front of a formation group and said your body is the enemy. It was subtler, more architectural, built into the daily structure of religious life in a way that you absorbed without ever quite noticing you were absorbing it. The theology of the body that we were given was beautiful in many ways, genuinely beautiful. There was real depth there, real dignity, real truth about the human person, and what love is, and what it costs, and what it's for. I don't want to dismiss that, but nested inside the beauty was a lesson that most of us received without knowing we were receiving it. The lesson was this: the body is where sin begins. The flesh is where temptation lives. And for a woman in religious life, the correct relationship with her own physical self was one of consistent, practiced minimization. You ate what the community ate, not what you wanted. You slept when the schedule said to sleep. You wore what you were told to wear, cut to shapes that ensured your body would not be a presence in any room you entered. The body was not the site of joy or pleasure or curiosity. The body was something you managed, something you offered up, something you learned to make quiet. 4 years of that does something to a woman. 4 years of learning to distrust physical sensation, to interpret bodily awareness as a distraction at best, and a temptation at worst, to treat the question of what you feel or want or need in your body as spiritually irrelevant. That is not a minor adjustment. That is a rewiring. And it does not undo itself the day you walk out the convent gate in secular clothes with a small bag and a phone you barely know how to use. I remember the first time a man touched my hand in a non-medical, non-incidental way after I left. We were at a parish social. He was handing me a cup of something. Our fingers overlapped for maybe 2 seconds. And my entire interior life lit up with alarm bells that I could not explain and could not turn off, because I had been trained for years to treat physical awareness as something that needed to be reported to God and examined for signs of disorder. 2 seconds, a cup, fingers overlapping, and I spent 3 days treating it like a confessional matter. That is what formation without truth produces. Not purity, not holy indifference. Women who have been trained so thoroughly to distrust their own bodies that ordinary human contact becomes a spiritual emergency. And when those women eventually enter relationships, when they fall in love, when they find themselves in bedrooms with men they have chosen and promised themselves to, they carry that training with them. They carry the alarm bells, they carry the suspicion toward their own sensation. They carry the reflexive distrust of anything that feels like pleasure. And no one, in all those years of beautiful, sincere, deeply meant formation, ever thought to tell them that the body was allowed to have a language. That desire is not automatically disorder. That a woman's experience of her own physical self is not evidence of spiritual failure. Because that truth would have required someone to say something out loud that the institution needed to remain unsaid. The third thing we were taught about men is the most quietly devastating of all, that a good woman makes herself small enough not to need anything. This is the one that took me the longest to name, because it was the one most dressed in genuine virtue, selflessness, service, the laying down of personal desire in favor of something greater. These are real things, valuable things. I still believe in them, but in the context of what we were actually taught, in the lived reality of what was communicated to us day after day and year after year, they became something else entirely. They became a template for self-erasure. A woman who does not need anything is not a spiritual achievement. She is a woman who has been taught so thoroughly that her needs are an inconvenience, that she has learned to stop perceiving them, to translate hunger into offering, to transform loneliness into prayer, to take every genuine human longing and reframe it as an opportunity for mortification rather than a signal that something real and legitimate requires attention. I have a friend who spent 7 years in formation. She left 2 years after I did. She is one of the most competent, clear-eyed, loving people I have ever met. She eventually married a man she loves deeply. And she told me, a year into her marriage, something that has stayed with me ever since. She said she didn't know how to tell him what she needed. Not in bed, though that too, but in everything. She didn't know how to say I'm tired or that hurt, or I need more time, or I don't want to do this right now. She said the words existed in her head but something between her thoughts and her mouth refused to let them through. Because somewhere in 7 years of formation, the act of voicing a need had become synonymous with spiritual weakness, with a failure of surrender, with evidence that you had not yet let go of the self enough. She said her husband, patient and kind and genuinely wanting to understand her, eventually said something that broke her open entirely. He said, I cannot love the version of you that you're performing. I need to know which one is real. She sat with that for weeks. Because she had been performing for so long, she had partially lost track of the original. That is the third lesson. The woman who doesn't need anything. The woman whose silence is her holiness. The woman who has mistaken self-erasure for virtue so completely that she no longer notices the erosion. And the men these women eventually loved were handed someone they thought was a complete person, and were actually given someone still in the process of recovering her own interior life. Someone who had been taught that desire was dangerous, that need was weakness, that the correct posture toward her own experience was one of continuous, graceful minimization. No one told those men that. No one told those women. And so everyone fumbled in the dark together with the very best intentions and the very worst maps. I want to tell you about the evening I actually understood what had been left out. It was not a dramatic moment. It didn't happen in a therapist's office or during a prayer or at any of the turning points you might expect. It happened in a bookstore, 2 years after I left. I was standing in the health section, which I had never had much occasion to enter, and I picked up a book that was simply and plainly about women's bodies. Not spiritual, not devotional, just factual, just honest. Just information in ordinary language about how a woman's body works, what it needs, what is normal, what is not. I stood in that aisle and read the first chapter where I was standing, and I started to cry. Not dramatically, not loudly, just quietly, and with a deep sense of something I can only describe as grief on behalf of myself at 22. Because everything in those pages was information that I should have had. Not as something illicit or shameful or spiritually complicated, but simply as a woman, as a person living in a body that was always going to be part of my life, regardless of what vows I took or didn't take. I had been taught so thoroughly to treat my body as a spiritual liability that the experience of reading straightforward, kind, non-judgmental information about it felt like an act of transgression, like I was doing something dangerous just by knowing. I bought the book. I read all of it. I bought 4 more. And then I found a therapist, a woman with a warm office and a particular gift for sitting with people who are still learning how to take up space. And in our second session I described what I had been taught. Not dramatically, just factually, just laying it out in order. She listened the way good therapists listen, fully and without flinching. And when I finished, she said something I have thought about almost every day since. She said, "You weren't failed by people who didn't care about you. You were failed by a system that confused your silence with your holiness. And those are not the same thing." I turned that over for months. Because she was right. The silence had been genuine. The love behind it had been genuine. The sisters who formed me, the women who handed me those 11 words and thought they were sufficient, they were not cruel. They were not negligent in the way we usually mean that word. They were women who had received the same silence and understood it the same way, and passed it forward with complete sincerity. But sincerity does not make silence kind. It just makes it inherited. And somewhere in the long chain of women who taught their daughters, and novices and charges to be small, and quiet and needless and grateful, someone would have had to stop and ask, is this actually love? Is this actually preparation? Is this what we would want for someone we genuinely treasured? And no one did. Because the silence was not just modesty, the silence was structural. It held the whole architecture upright. A woman who knows her body, who has language for her needs, who understands that her experience matters and that her voice in a relationship is not an act of pride but an act of love. That woman is harder to keep compliant. She asks questions. She names things. She takes up the space she was always supposed to occupy, and a system built on a certain kind of female silence cannot easily accommodate that woman. So it simply doesn't create her. I am not telling this story to make you angry at the church, or at convents, or at the women who formed me with such genuine and limited care. The years I spent in religious life gave me things I would not trade. A capacity for stillness that has held me through the hardest seasons since I left. A sense of something larger than the immediate that keeps me from collapsing under ordinary pressure. A love of prayer that is damaged and rebuilt, and complicated and still real. I will not pretend those things away to make a cleaner story. But I am telling this story because I know that what happened to me did not only happen inside convent walls. There are women in churches right now, in mosques, in temples, in conservative families and traditional communities and religious schools, where the preparation they are receiving for love and intimacy and their own bodies consists of the same architecture of silence dressed in different theological language. Stay modest. Be patient. Men have needs. A good woman doesn't complain. Your desires are not the point. Your silence is your faithfulness. And those women will walk into relationships and marriages and bedrooms and mornings after that left them wordless, and they will carry the alarm bells and the inherited smallness and the performed contentment, and they will call it holiness, because that is the only word they were given for what they are doing. I want those women to hear this. Your body is not a liability. It is not a site of danger. It is not a spiritual problem requiring management. It is yours. It has always been yours. The fact that you were taught to distrust it is not evidence that the distrust was correct. It is evidence that the system needed you distracted from yourself to function the way it was designed to function. You are allowed to know your own body. You are allowed to have needs and to name them. You are allowed to say this doesn't feel right, and I need more time and wait, and not yet without it constituting a failure of faith or love or virtue. You are allowed to take up the space in a relationship that a full human person actually requires, not the edited, minimized, gracefully silent version that the institution needed you to be. Those things are not sin. They are not immodesty. They are not selfishness dressed up in pride. They are the most basic inheritance every woman was always supposed to receive, and it was taken from you deliberately, carefully, across generations of women who didn't know they were taking it because they never had it themselves. The thing that nobody told me on the day I left with my small bag and my secular clothes and my 11 words of preparation is the thing I want to leave you with now. You do not need to earn the right to know yourself. That right was never contingent on how quiet you were, or how small you made yourself, or how thoroughly you had routed desire out of your interior life. It was yours the whole time. And the silence was never holy. It was never protection. It was never modesty in the true sense of that word. It was just silence, passed down through hands that trembled with genuine love and genuine limitation, from women who knew no other way to prepare the women who came after them. The chain can stop. It stops when we name what was actually handed to us. It stops when we choose to give the women who come after us something more honest, more generous, more true. It stops when someone decides that a woman walking toward love deserves a real map, not 11 words and a door closing softly behind her. If this story stayed with you, tell me in the comments. Tell me what part landed. Tell me your own version if you're ready. I read every single one, and you are never as alone in this as the silence was designed to make you feel. Subscribe to this channel. There is still so much left to say. Until next time, your voice belongs to you. It always did. Even when they taught you that offering it up was the holiest thing you could do with it.